Welcome to Thinking is Contagious. I want to speak today about the 1619 Project. I'm going to take some thoughts from American Thinker, an article by Mark Scaringi in August of 2019. So some of what you're going to hear here is attributable to his writing in American Thinker. But the 1619 Project, the creator Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is a New York Times writer, and the basic premise is that slavery was introduced into America through Jamestown, 1619, and that the intent was by the founding of Jamestown. The people who founded it, they were here in order to protect their rights to own slaves and to enrich the slave trade, and that's been proven false. Jamestown was created by a British trade company. They came in search of gold and of trade and of trying to create a new avenue for wealth creation through the Americas. Hannah-Jones very vocally claims that whites are as racist today as the forefathers, but that we have evolved to cover racism with, and this is a quote, a sheen of deniability, and that from Jamestown until today, racism is an intentional act by whites against blacks. She claims that blacks at Jamestown were enslaved by whites. The fact is that those first 20 slaves that were disembarked at Jamestown were taken from a Portuguese ship, and the Portuguese had taken the slaves forcibly from Angola. In 1619, the Portuguese were in business with the Imbangala. Imbangala was a fierce African tribe that lived from enslaving Africans and to provide them for sale to Europe. So these were Africans, these were blacks who raided villages, seized the citizens, enslaved them, made them captive, and sold them to the Portuguese, who in turn sold them to Europe and the Americas as well. The Portuguese used the Imbangala, as I said, to enslave the neighboring Ndongo tribe, and that's where they ended up getting their inventory, so to speak, of slaves. As to the specific slaves that disembarked in Jamestown, Hannah-Jones writes that they were no longer Mandabu or Akin or Fulani, which is correct. They were no longer members of their African tribes. But what she fails to edify us about, inform us about, is that while they were free a few months prior, the reason that they were not free at the time was because Africans had captured them and enslaved them. So the Mubundu, were part of the Ndongo kingdom, which had a very large slave population, and about a third of the Akan states were slaves. So by the late 19th century, slaves still constituted about 50% of that Fulani Emirate empire. And in Africa, it's a caste system. So that means that those that were slaves were not the upper caste blacks, because they're not going to obviously enslave their caste members, their children, their children. They were going to enslave the lower caste members. They were going to capture them, enslave them, and that's who they sold to the Portuguese. So you see, it's a very large fallacy that it was the whites who were solely responsible for the problem. Certainly, there were whites who were responsible for the problem because they ended up buying slaves, which is wrong. But the business, the enslavement business, has as much the fingerprints of the black Africans as anyone else, if not more so. So slavery was not introduced to America by whites in Jamestown. It was a product of the supply from Africa, which ended up in Jamestown. And also, just so we're aware, when the Pilgrims landed in this country, in Jamestown, the Native Americans also enslaved, used slavery, used their own people as slaves. And so slavery existed here already. So those are a couple of points that you need to hear. But I want to really get on to a little bit more now about slavery itself and some of the fallacies that have been perpetrated about it. And again, not belittling, it is wrong, 100%. But let's look at how and what was going on at the time. And you go back, even the much hated Confederate Robert E. Lee called slavery a moral, and there's a quote, a moral and political evil. Yet he concluded that black slaves were better off morally, socially, and physically in the U.S. than they were in Africa. And that alludes to what we were discussing previously about how they were enslaved by their own people, the caste system, and what they were subject to in Africa, the way they were treated, which was as livestock. In 1860, and I'm going to give you some statistics according to U.S. Census, so it's not slanted or biased. In 1860, it was actually a small majority of whites that owned slaves, disproportionate to their representation in society. The 1860 U.S. Census says 27 million whites lived in the U.S., and 8 million of those lived in the slavehold states, the southern states. So 8 million lived there. The census also determined that fewer than 385,000 white people owned slaves. And even if all the slave owners had been white, fewer than 385,000 total people owned slaves. And that even if the slave owners had been all white, that means that 1.4% of the population, of the white population in the country owned slaves. And if you wanted to limit it only to the southern states, which is a less of the 8 million population, even then it's 4.8%, less than 5% of the people. And let's assume once again that they were all white, which they weren't. We'll go into it now. So it's less than 5%. So the same argument that today you're having about the top 1% and how elite that is and how rarefied air it is and how it's not fair because the top 1% owns so much wealth. And also, so if it's so unfair because it's such a small proportion of the population that is benefiting from the wealth building in this country as is being claimed now, it was an equally small amount of people that owned slaves. Okay, white people that owned slaves. But let's go into that a little more. In 1830, 1/4 of the free Negro slave masters in South Carolina owned 10 or more slaves. So 1/4 of the free Negro slave masters owned 10 or more slaves. From the census, June 1st, 1860, there were 4.5 million Negroes in the U.S., with fewer than 4 million living in the southern stateholder states. And of the blacks residing in the South, 262,000 were not slaves. Of this number, 10,700 lived in New Orleans. And they're using New Orleans as a sample. And again, it's not a fair assessment, the percentage, because it's a very limited scope, a limited test area. But they used it as an example, and I'm going to repeat it. Duke University professor John Hope Franklin, who was considered the country's leading African American historian, said in New Orleans, 3,000 of the 10,700 blacks who lived there owned slaves, which is 28% of the population. So 28% in New Orleans versus 1.4% in the nation of slave owners, and 4.8% in the South who owned slaves. Again, I understand it's a very small sample size in New Orleans, but I'm doing it for the effect of percentages. Stat shows, statistically then, it showed, based on the census's overall numbers, that the free blacks, when they became free, disproportionately became slave masters, became disproportionate the number who became slave masters, based on U.S. Census statistics. Although slavery was abolished in America 150 years ago, let's look at today, where it thrives. And that is in Africa. Africa has the highest rate of enslavement in the world, with nearly 10 million enslaved today. There are more than 3 times as many people in forced servitude today as were captured and sold, listen to this, during the 350-year span of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I understand the population has geometrically increased. So once again, you can make statistics say anything you want. I'm not going on the number. I'm going on the concept, the theory, and the lies that you're being fed, that the issue is a white versus black, that it's a race issue. It's not. It's a cultural issue. It's a socio-economic issue. When the world's leading slave master today in 2020 is Africa, I think you can see where all this is coming from. This is the playing of the race card in this country continues, and it's been augmented and magnified since 2008, when the United States boldly elected a black man as their president and then re-elected him in 2012, cutting out the legs and the claims of those who lived and thrived and flourished and made their livelihoods on the fact that systemic racism existed in this country. And that was taken away from them with the election of Barack Obama. Since then, they have worked feverishly to interject and bring back the race issue in this country, because they need it in order to continue their business. And their business is racism and hatred. Again, I'm going to close with the Thinking is Contagious. The name of the program, Thinking is Contagious. But don't forget that the left, the Democrats, the liberal left, continue to work feverishly and fervently to find a vaccine to prevent its spread. Thank you. Have a good day. Hope you enjoyed this.